valuable at all. Not at all. It means that every single human being is of infinite value because Jesus died for them. But as we look at these texts, as we look at the Bible, we see these things and we start to think. And as I'm preaching this sermon, there's another parable which comes to mind. And this is the amazing thing about the Bible. This parable I'm thinking is the one lost sheep. How it signifies that the 99 were inside the church, but there was that one lost sheep outside the church. And this is the interesting thing is, we as Christians, we as Seventh Adventists, we as people which love God, we need to put our effort and energy into bringing the truth to the world. Bringing the truth to the people outside the doors of the church. Because they are of infinite value. So the question is, what is life? And I remember reading, in some colleges they have a college yearbook, and I remember reading different people's aims and desires and purposes in life. And as they graduated, they put in their yearbook, my aim is I want to be a preacher, my aim is I want to do health work, my aim is whatever it may be. And there's one comment which one person put down, which particularly rang out in my mind was, it was not an aim of life, it was life they'd written down. So I want to summarize, what is life? Being born, okay? We don't really have a choice whether we're born or not, do we? But that's the starting point of what is life. Often children will go to school, they'll go to college, they'll have a job. Some people will get married, some people have children. Retirement, unfortunately, old age comes, and also being laid to rest. Now, when I look at those different aspects of life, and you could argue there's many more, are any of those things really your life's calling? That's just no. That's just life, isn't it? It's a bit like saying I wake up in the morning and I start breathing. Well, that's just life. We just start breathing. It's a normal concept of life. So what does it mean to be our life's calling? And I want to ask you a question. Do you know specifically what your life's calling is? If you don't, we need to get on our knees and pray to Jesus to show us that our life's calling. And there's many different callings in life. There's many different. You may be called in the world to be able to help people with their health. You may be called to be a preacher. You may be called to give Bible studies. You may be called to whatever it might be. And there's one thing I would like to say. Some of you know me for some time. And you'll know the work of Advent Books with distributing literature by the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. And you'll know other things. It's like online, these sermons will go out, and over time, probably on different sermons all added up, it'll be thousands of people watching it. But I believe the most effective use how God has been able to use me is on a one-to-one basis, meeting my work colleagues, meeting friends, meeting people as they walk by, as they come and visit. So I do not want us to be able to think that we should be focusing on this big life's calling and we neglect the relationships which we have today and the work colleagues we meet. A work colleague I met in my previous job, it's very interesting. He was and is a Christian, but I was able to talk to him, and he now believes that Saturday is the Sabbath. He also believes that he had the belief that, which lots of Christians do have, that when you die you either go to heaven or hell, and you're going to spend eternity in hell. He used to believe that. So I explained it from a biblical point of view, and he says that makes sense. About when you die, you're resting until Jesus comes, and there's no eternal hell, We'll be consumed if we have not followed Jesus with fire until we're gone. Because why would a loving God want to torture people for eternity? Of course, he would not. But that's just an example, and that wasn't preaching. That was just gaining a friendship, and as I gained that friendship, we'd be able to talk. And I try to speak to him once a week, although it's been hard the last few weeks. But I want to look at some Bible examples. We touched on this as part of the introduction. Bible examples. Samuel was a child. And this is probably one of the biggest things. I want you to turn your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1. So that's 1 Samuel chapter 3, verses 1 to 11. I wish I could remember how old Samuel was now. I thought it was 8 for some reason, but 7, okay, I'm a year, thank you. 7 years of age. And often we think 7 is too young. It's not. Often we think maybe 8 to 90 years is too old. It's not. So 1 Samuel chapter 3 verse 1, which we read in a few moments. You see, as you go through life, what is the greatest thief of time? What's the greatest thief of time? Procrastination. We procrastinate and procrastinate and procrastinate. And this is the interesting thing it's like, well, I'm going to start doing God's work when I've finished my education. I need to get my college out of the way, I'm studying. And then you think, well, I'm going to do God's work once I've paid my mortgage off. And then you think, I'm going to do God's work once I retire. When I retire, I'm going to have loads of time. But if you fall into any of those categories, there's one thing I can guarantee. Unless you change your mindset and your way your mind works, you will never have enough time. Because the thief of time is yourself, procrastinating. So Samuel was age 7, which is really quite young, isn't it? But let's start reading. 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1. And the child Samuel ministered unto the Lord before Eli. And the word of the Lord was precious in those days. There was no open vision. And it came to pass at that time, when Eli was laid down in his place, and his eyes began to wax dim, that he could not see. And ere the lamp of God went out in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was, and Samuel was laid down to sleep. So we see here Samuel is in the temple. Samuel's quite simple so far. Samuel's been laid down to sleep. Then in verse 4, that the Lord called Samuel, and he answered, Here am I. And he ran unto Eli and said, Here am I, for thou callest me. And he said, this is Eli replying, and he said, I called not, lie down again. And he went and lay down. And the Lord called yet again, Samuel. And Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, Here am I, for thou didst call me. And he answered, I called not, my son, lie down again. Notice what's happening. God is calling, Samuel's trying to answer. God is calling, Samuel's trying to answer. But let's read on. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, neither was the word of the Lord yet revealed unto him. And the Lord called Samuel again, the third time. And he arose and went to Eli and said, Here am I, for thou didst call me. And Eli perceived that the Lord had called the child. Sometimes in life we're looking for God's calling, and as we're looking for God's calling, we don't persevere. It's almost like we have a casual conversation. God, I want you to know what I want to do in my life. And maybe God has answered, but we're not listening. But notice what's happening here with Samuel and Eli. Samuel's being called not once, not twice, not 3 times, but on the 3rd time, he then realizes it's God talking to him. And that's the same as with ourselves. God is trying to talk to us, but are we listening? Now in verse 9, therefore Eli said unto Samuel, go lie down, and it shall be, if he call thee, that thou shouldst say, speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. And the Lord came and stood and called me at other times, Samuel, Samuel. Then Samuel answered, speak, for thy servant heareth. I just want to pause one moment. When we go to God asking for direction, do we go to God and say, look, God, I've got this plan. I want to do this, this, and this. I want your approval. Or do we go to God and say, God, I'm your servant. I'm listening. Notice the difference. I do believe that God expects us to use our brains with things, but we need to have a brain which can absorb God's word, and we can listen to what God says to us. Because in verse 11, and the Lord said to Samuel, behold, I will do a thing in Israel, at which both the ears of everyone that heareth it shall tingle. So God is calling Samuel, and Samuel is there as a willing servant for God. Now, how old are you girls again? 9 and 7. Okay. So Samuel was the age of the youngest person in this room. And God had a work for Samuel. And I believe God has a work for each one of us. And as we're sitting there praying and trying to see what God's work is for you and I, should we just say, well, I'm just going to sit down in this chair and just do nothing until God specifically tells me? We still need to be active, trying to help others and bring people to know Jesus. But I like the example of Samuel, because whatever age we are, we can still help and still follow God's calling. So there's another person I like the example of in the Bible, and this is Saul. Does anyone know the story of Saul? Saul became Paul. And I want you to turn this time into Acts chapter 9, verses 3 to 9. So Acts chapter 9, verses 3 to 9. I'll give you a few moments to find this. But I like this example of Paul for two reasons. Because often, traditionally speaking, you go to school, you learn, then after you've been to school, you then maybe go to college. And then you go to college, and maybe sometimes you go to college to learn to be a Bible worker or preacher, whatever it may be. And then you spend the next 30, 40, 50 years of your life in that particular training you've just received. But Paul, does anybody know how old Paul was? Or Saul was? Does anybody know? I'm glad no one's saying they don't know, because I don't believe it's recorded. But he must have been 30, 40 years of age, because he had a responsible job before he became Paul, didn't he? He had a responsible job. His job was to go around and round up all the Christians and have them persecuted, have them killed for being Christians. Am I right? That's a quite responsible job. And the reason why I like the story of Saul is, for two reasons. He was older, but God still called him. And also, despite his past, God still had a work for him. And this is the interesting thing here is, I don't believe anybody in this room has killed one person. Don't put your hand up if you have. But I don't believe anybody has killed one person. But let's imagine we had somebody sitting in the pew here, and they were known that that person had killed another person. A lot of us would be reserved. A lot of us would be, whoa, we're not talking to that person. But Saul was actively rounding up the Christians and persecuting them and having them executed. But God had a work for that person. So I don't want anybody to be able sitting in their pew today thinking, either I'm too old, or thinking God can't use me because I've done all these bad things in my life. Because one thing for sure If God can use somebody which would round up the Christians and persecute the Christians, he can use you and I today. But let's go to Acts chapter 9 and verse 3. And this reads, "And as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly there shined round about him a light from heaven. And he fell on the earth, and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And he said, Who art thou, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks. And he trembled, and astonished said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And the Lord said unto him, Arise and go into the city, and it shall be told thee what thou must do. I want to pause there one moment. What's that basically saying? Saul's been traveling, and the Lord appears to him, and he says, I am Jesus, thou persecutest. Because if you persecute God's children, you're persecuting Jesus himself. Kick against the pricks. What does that mean? You're resisting me. You're resisting following Jesus. But going back on to verse 7 now. And the men which journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man. And Saul arose from the earth, and when his eyes were opened, he saw no man. But they led him by the hand, and brought him into Damascus. And he was there 3 days without sight, neither did eat nor drink. And we know the story of Saul. Saul became Paul, and Paul went out there to work for Jesus. So I don't want anybody to say, I've been too bad. I've done this, I've done that. I can't follow Jesus. I can't work for him. If Saul could do it, we can do it. And the interesting thing is, when you look at Christ's disciples, most of the disciples, if not all the disciples, they came from a very interesting past, didn't they? You know, some of them are fishermen, rough fishermen, but God was able to use them. Because what's the number one requirement to be in God's work? Number one requirement is to want to follow Jesus. Number two requirement is to be willing to follow Jesus. Now, if Jesus was alive today and he was sitting down with people, they would recommend that he would go to where? To get their workers. You know, Jesus went and found fishermen by the sea. But maybe they would say, you need to go to the temple. You need to go to see the Pharisees and go and get the learned people. Today we would translate that, must go to the seminaries, must go to the colleges. But I used to have a job, you know. And this one job, it was working for a big company. And I worked in the accounts department, it was only as a temp. But they would say they preferred to recruit people which had just done their A-levels compared to had the degree in the subject, because they were easier to work with and they were easy to be told how to do the job, compared to when people go and get a degree, they like to come into the place and tell people how to do it, which is theoretical and not practical. And Jesus was able to take those disciples like they were a blank piece of canvas, or just like a lump of clay, and to mold them into how Jesus wanted those disciples to be. And the Christian message went from Christ to the disciples, to the wider group of disciples, to the entire world, because they had the love of Jesus. Matthew chapter 9 and verse 9. We see how Christ is calling the disciples. Matthew 9 verse 9. And this reads, And as Jesus passed forth from thence, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the receipt of custom, and he said unto him, Follow me. And he arose and followed him. Did Jesus choose the disciples because they were perfect? No. The disciples were on the same path which we're on, the same path where we are working with Jesus to overcome our characters and to become perfect. And the disciples were on the same path. We know the story of the disciples. We know that Peter tried to defend his Lord and cut off the soldier's ear. We know so many different things. And the greatest need in Christ's life, when he wanted the disciples to pray with them, what were the disciples doing? Sleeping. Sounds very much like Christians today, doesn't it? But you know what, my brothers and sisters? This is encouraging and warming to each one of us today, because Jesus is calling us to be disciples and workers with him. This is linked to what I was saying earlier on. Matthew 9 verse 35 now. Matthew 9 verse 35. Because this was how Jesus was most effective. He dwelt among the people. I was having a conversation with our sisters over here earlier, and I asked the question is, how well do we know our local community? Do we know them by name? Do we know them by person? If we don't, how can we reach them? How can we tell them about Jesus if we don't even know who they are? But in Matthew 9 verse 35 it reads, "And Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every sickness and every disease among the people." Jesus went to the cities. He went to where the people were to share the gospel. How can we tell people about Jesus if we don't know the people, we don't talk to the people? So the first requirement for working for Jesus is loving Jesus, knowing Jesus. In Mark 3 verse 14, some of you may be sitting there thinking, it's like, I don't have a degree in theology, I can't preach. Somebody may be sitting there thinking, I can't speak Greek and Hebrew. Some of you may be sitting there thinking, I've never been trained. Nor had the disciples. The disciples were normal people, but they were willing. Sometimes in man-made society, man-made religion and traditions, we put a lot of value into you must go to college or university for 4 years, to a seminary. And then you must go through a whole big ordination service so you can be ordained to be a pastor or to be a lay worker or whatever it may be. This is the interesting thing. And this is actually quite funny and actually quite amusing. Because often people ask the question, if you become an elder or if you become a pastor, are they ordained? And they make a big thing out of the ordination. But what's it say in the Bible? The first church pastors were the 12 disciples. And you would think there'd be maybe a whole chapter dedicated to the ordination service. You would think maybe there was so much there. But what does it say? In Mark 3 verse 14, it says these words, "And he ordained the 12, that they should be with him, and that he might send them forth to preach." My understanding is that is all it says. So if you are sitting there thinking, I have not been ordained through some man-made service and gone through a man-made educational course, so I can't do God's work, you're wrong. Because the first people which Christ ordained himself, that was the service he did. He ordained the 12. And this is why we need to be ordained by God. We need to have God speaking to us. We need the love of Jesus. We need to follow Jesus. And we have the Holy Spirit to guide us and help us through life. What is our calling? What is your calling? I was talking to my brother-in-law once, and he said something which has made an impression on my mind. You know, all of us, we need to go to work, don't we? We need money to live on. You know, we can't go to the supermarket and get free food. We need money. But most of us think that the main reason why we go to work is to earn money. That's a big part of it, isn't it? But the main reason we go to work is because then we can talk to other people and tell them about Jesus. And a byproduct is we get money. Okay, we need money to pay mortgage, to pay bills, etc. So that may be part of your calling. But what is your calling? I don't know your calling, but I know somebody who does. Jesus knows your calling. Maybe it's to witness in work, as I just said. Maybe it's to do Bible studies. Maybe do preaching. Maybe helping people through their health. Jesus spent most of his time doing what? Preaching or healing? Healing through their health. Helping people by showing them the love of Christ. Through kindness. Giving people hope through friendship, that word love again, and encouraging one another. Saving souls for Jesus. You know, there's one thing which Christians in general can be very good at, and it's knowing the Bible. Theoretically, they can know it inside out. They can quote maybe entire verses or entire books. But you know what, the most important thing is knowing Jesus. Because people want to know Jesus. I don't mean the theory of Jesus, I mean the practice of Jesus. And when I say the practice of Jesus, what I mean is how we treat people out on the street, how we treat people in our workplace, a practical sense of knowing and loving Jesus. And when people come into church, whatever their past may be, whatever problems they've had in the week, whether they've been able to live a righteous life or they've fallen into sin in that week, they need to know that when they come to meet proper Christians which love Jesus, which do rely on their Bible, but not just for doctrine, but for genuine practical Christianity. They know that they can come to us. We will not judge them, but we'll take them to the foot of the cross to see Jesus. I believe that everyone in the kingdom of heaven will have a crown. We're told that. And on that crown there will be jewels. And those jewels will represent those which we've told about Jesus. Our aim, my brothers and sisters, is to hasten Christ's return. In Mark, we're told that this gospel needs to go to the whole world, and then the end shall come. Often, and this is the wrong thing with Christians. Maybe this is an anti-Christian sermon today. This is the wrong thing with Adventists as well. We often judge the success of a church based on how many people are sitting in the main service. But the success of a church is down to what the church does outside of these doors compared to inside of these doors. We can measure the success of a church not on this earth, but in the heavenly kingdom. Because so often we think, we've got to get Bible studies, we've got to get baptisms, and that's very important. We've got to get people to church. And I love to see people in church, don't get me wrong. But that's not the aim. The aim, by God's grace, is to take them to the foot of the cross, introduce them to Jesus. And the aim is to see them in the heavenly kingdom. An eternal aim. And I do believe that we have our life's calling. By God's grace, I believe I know my life's calling. My question to you, do you know what your life's calling is? And my challenge to you, if you don't know your life's calling, is for you to be able to go home this evening, kneel down and pray, and ask for God to make that clear to you. If you do know your life's calling, my chance for you is to go home, get down on your knees and pray so God can help clarify and tweak that life's calling. So we can be walking with Jesus. You know, my brothers and sisters, I have a friend. And my friend, he's not a Seventh-day Adventist yet, I keep saying that. But when he was 40 years of age, he retired. He went off to Asia, was on a small yacht, now has got a farm, and he retired. I'd love to do the same, but I can't. I can't, because I love the British people too much. My life's calling is to bring the Adventist message, the true Christian message, to this kingdom, the United Kingdom, whichever way God will help me. And my challenge to you is, what is your life's calling? Because God's got to work for you. May God richly bless each one of you today. We're going to close the service with the use of